Hello, listener. This little ramble will be about mankind's eternal fight against entropy. There's this thinker from the who founded neo-reactionary thought, actually, called Mencius Moldbug, and he has got a famous quote that Cthulhu only ever swims leftward. Now, this sort of flowery language is very typical of Mencius Moldbug, but what he means by that is that, well, ideas move towards the left, and Cthulhu is a representation of entropy. And I think entropy is what the enemy of humanity is, both in ideas and in the world. There's this progressive notion of history wherein we are ever moving forwards to an ideal society. This is a somewhat post-Protestant view of history. It has Christian foundations. It's very teleological. That Christianity, of course, has the idea of a doomsday, of the return of Jesus and the ascension to heaven, and the day of judgment. But this progressivist view of things is sort of a secularized version of the judgment day vision in Christianity. But it is also somewhat post-Protestant because that's when it emerges. You get the Whig view of history, and then a little bit after that you get Hegel. And Hegel is very foundational to this view of a linear, progressive history. He's the one who proposes dialectic, which later Marx uses to formulate his theory of dialectic materialism of history. Most leftist and even liberal and even center-conservative right views of history have become linear, whereas the traditional, ancient tradition, the traditionalist perspective is that history is cyclical. And the most eloquent writer to have represented this view of history is Oswald Spengler. But it can also be found in ancient Greek mythology, in the way the Romans wrote about history. The ancient classical world, almost all myths have cycles of death and rebirth and so on, because it's quite logical. The world has seasons. Everything, life has a cycle. You are born, you grow old, you die. You have your own children, you see them grow up and so on. Life is quite cyclical in the slow pace of life that traditional societies used to have. It is tied to technological progress as well, this view of progressive history. And the proof, basically, of progressive history is cited as the technological progress. And it is true that, in a sense, there is this underlying narrative of eternal progress in history. Not conscious, not necessarily technological, but in terms of productivity. At one point, humanity on Earth consisted of maybe 5,000 individuals. Today there are 7.5 billion, and every day there are more people on this planet. And throughout history, we have year over year, decade over decade, century over century, millennium over millennium, grown the population of this earth. Every civilization, if you look at from century to century, grows in numbers. And it grows in how much it produces. Food, wares, capital investment basically grows through history. There are, of course, events of great capital destruction, like the fall of Rome, like the cyclical fallings of Chinese dynasties and so on. But year over year, and I've discussed this with a friend of mine who's an engineer who's a little bit autistic about numbers and so on, who's done all the data analysis that he could find through history. Year over year, there's about 1.2% growth in our productivity output, from about 1,000 before Christ to today. And of course, that's 1.2% growth is fairly constant up until the Industrial Revolution, and in the Industrial Revolution it explodes upward. That's the proof. The proof for progressivism is that this idea of technological progress. Of course, they tie this to ideas of social progress, social values. Basically, more liberty and freedom is progress. Total liberty at the expense of everything else at this point. And of course, the idea that there's progressive social values is completely subjective, because what is progress? You first have to define what progress is. You have to set your goal posts. You have to say this is good, this is bad. And of course, that's been kind of the fight of political parties and political discourse for the last 2 centuries or so. Because this whole pendulum swing in political parties and so on, I don't think any of that existed before 2 centuries ago. I really think that this manifestation of political polarization and ideological infighting is a post-industrial, post-modern, not modern, as in the modern era, phenomenon. Before then, everyone was united under Christian conceptions, and any discourse was within the concept of Christian tradition. And before Christianity, it would have been whatever pagan traditions we had here. I think, for example, if you look at Hindu society, you would see more or less what they would be doing in terms of their philosophy, and they are not divided against themselves either. They are not. I mean, there are of course religious wars, but they don't divide their own societies against themselves so much like we do with modern political theory today. Now, the fight against entropy is not just fighting against these leftist ideas. It's also entropy is at the center of the universe. Everything decays, and so does society, and so does everything we as humans build. We constantly need to maintain our infrastructure. We're constantly putting physical labor into maintaining our roads and maintaining our buildings, maintaining our electrical grid. Quite a lot of our population is employed, not in necessarily building new things, but upkeep of that which is already in existence. That's the fight against entropy. And this fight against entropy happens in the idea sphere as well. In engineers and so on, and scientists, they find new ways to automatize labor. So we have to do less physical labor, and we can produce more mental labor to find new ways to combat entropy. But the problem is entropy is in the mind as well, and that's what mentions Malbec means with Cthulhu only ever swims leftward. It takes quite a lot of effort to maintain traditional society. It requires discipline, it requires harshness. You will have capital punishment for those who infringe it. You have social ostracization to those who infringe social norms. For example, Erasmus, the Dutch philosopher, wrote a book about customs, in which things we consider as extremely normal today, such as chewing with your mouth closed and not sniffing your nose in public and so on, and dining with cutlery and many other forms of proper behavior, which we consider very normal today, were codified. And he codified them because they at that point were not normal for anyone outside the aristocracy. So these modes of behavior, they have to be trained up, codified, written down, and then the entire population have to be basically conditioned to follow them. And conditioning the society to certain standards is what all societies do, but they can be more lax or more harsh. And traditional societies tend to have much harsher social rules, not just on morality, but also on, well, table manners for one, language, how you address people. Everything in traditional societies used to be much more strict and much more defined. You had, your social hierarchy. You had the way you addressed certain people based on age, based on gender, based on their position in the society. You would speak to an elderly doctor much more respectfully than you would speak to a young boy, and you would speak differently to a young girl than you would speak to a grandmother, and so on. But well, traditional society basically requires this constant fight against the entropy of the decay of morality. That's what churches and so on are for. I think really in many ways society, traditional society up until the modern age, was not much different from tribal society. And it really, humans cannot abandon tribalism because that's so deeply baked into us that will require several millennia of very selective breeding and self-domestication and radical genetic departure for us not to be tribal. Individualism simply destroys the individual. It does not remove the inherent thinking inside him, his genetic programming. The point is, almost all societies throughout human history have been basically some form of feudalism. And feudalism is structured tribalism, where you've got your local lord, which is your knight, and above him, basically a hierarchy of tribal leaders. Your baron, your count, and all the way up to the king. And then parallel to the tribal leader, the warrior caste, basically you have the shaman, the church, and the priest is basically a shaman. And today it's no different. We don't have the structured elite anymore. We have the business class, of course, which is separate, but we still have this sort of shamanistic class, which are psychologists and scientists and so on. And really, a psychologist is no different than a secular version of a priest because they do the same job. They are there to take care of the mental health of the population, because all therapy is talking to a person that has a perceived authority, in the case of a psychologist, a degree, and institutional support. And in the case of the priest, he has institutional support, but also basically the idea of the divine behind it, of spiritual right. And that's why I think that probably priests were more effective at treating mental issues than psychologists often are today. Although psychologists have science on their side, that's not always. The placebo effect is quite strong, right? And if you believe in God and you believe that godly authority is with the man that's your therapy, that counts for quite a lot more than just behaviorist and so on studies of how to deal with humans. That's just a bit of an analysis of society, really. But yeah, there's also the entropy of ideas. These rigid traditional societies, we've of course allowed them to decay. And that's what leftist thinking is. Leftist thinking is the entropy of all social norms. We still have the table manners for now, but the language is decaying. We already don't have hierarchized ways to address individuals based on their social status, because social status is relevant because everyone's equal. Basically, this decay of morals, this decay of standards, that's the entropy of ideas, and that's what leftism really represents in many of its basal modes of thinking. I mean, communism has some ideas beyond it, but at its core, liberalism and communism are basically the destruction of all impediments to freedom and equality of man. Communism more the equality, liberalism more the freedom. And social norms and hierarchy, that so on, are perceived to be really just impediments to individual freedom. That's bloody Rousseau again. The shackles of property, the shackles of hierarchy, the shackles of religion. The problem is that when you free man from all of those shackles, he doesn't become freer. Restricting the freedom of the individual makes the society more free, in my opinion, because it removes for quite a lot of the population the burdens of having to completely direct themselves, of completely having to discover everything in life. Because in many ways, tradition is a way of encoding successful survival strategies. The reason that we maintain certain traditions is because they are proven to be very effective. And so that, for example, the father teaches the son how to court women and so on, which he learned from his father. I mean, these things aren't just how to hunt a rabbit, right? These are social ways of behavior as well, which we've let decay to such a point that we probably won't be able to pass on much of the traditions onto our sons anymore, because we never learned them, because our fathers thought these were merely oppressive systems that needed to be forgotten, and that the best way to raise their children was to be in complete freedom and let them discover themselves. The problem is, if you say to a man, here you are, you have the freedom to be anything you want, and all the options in the world are open to you, about 80% of them will go into a crisis, because they don't know what they want, because quite a very few people actually know what they want in this world. The vast majority have no idea. And that's why we used to have all these institutions to guide people. To basically, you had your guilds and you had the church, and you followed your father's profession, and schools were made in such a way that they would guide you to a certain form of career if you showed aptitude for it, whether that was in the time of the cloisters or of the public schools. And that's also why we obviously segregated the sexes in schooling, because I can tell you from my experience, and I'm pretty sure that anyone who spent any time thinking about it, um, as a teenager, you spend more time thinking about the girls at your school than actually learning anything. And I think that has quite a lot to do with the undereducation of quite a few people today. Although I think that generally most people aren't capable of actually educating, because most people aren't actually capable of independent thought. But anyway, the fact that we've removed all guidance from society, that's the entropy again. And in a traditional society, people are aware of this, and you fight against the entropy and the chaos of freedom that destroys everything. Because freedom's nice for those who can handle certain freedoms. And there's always been the case in every society that those individuals who are capable of transcending the needs of the system could do so. There have been throughout history, for example, women who were the leaders of men and who were thinkers. Very, very much fewer than there were men, but they were there because they were exceptional individuals who were capable and were so inspiring that they could transcend all these petty hierarchies that existed for the mass. And so some men as well. The vast majority of men don't transcend their roles either. They're the warrior caste, they're the craftsman, they're the peasant. That's really not much different than we are today. It's just these days, in order to find your role, you're going to have about a decade of pointless souls of searching, of wasting your time in studies that maybe you aren't appropriate for, of being some underemployed or unemployed, of drinking away some years and so on. That's all that needless waste of productivity and of your own life could have been avoided by not giving you all this freedom that you can't handle. Anyway, that's entropy, and entropy is progressivism. And what progressives define as progress, I've never really understood this idea of progress. I think you have to deal with the world such as it is. And the fact of the matter is, we aren't shapers of our own individual destiny. For one, nature is it makes the bounds of our limitations. We have to obey the laws of motion. We have to obey the laws of gravity, because if we don't, we simply die. We try to defy them. And it is, of course, very Faustian. Yes, I know I'm called Faust. To try and transcend the limits of nature, but the limits of nature will absolutely crush you in your attempts to do so. We can sometimes develop things that elevate us somewhat above nature, but we can never completely overcome nature. We can make the atom bomb, but we take that too far, we destroy ourselves, like we nuke the planet, for example, or so on. So yeah, you have to obey nature's laws and also biological laws. Your body, whether you experience it to be a prison of flesh or simply the extension of your mind, is what you have to work with in this world. You are born with it. You can change little bits about it. You can change how muscular you are, how fat you are, through self-controlled discipline. But you cannot make yourself taller or think yourself to have 8 arms or something. That's simply not possible. You are bound by the biological limits, and those biological limits are in your brain as well, in your mind. You have the instincts and desires and ways of thinking that humans have simply developed towards. You cannot. Your hormones determine quite a lot about, or at any given moment, what your desires are, and your conscious mind is only a tiny fraction of your higher thinking. Does not really steer you in your life throughout. There is this perception that our conscious mind controls our body and controls all our thinking and our decisions, but that's really not true. Quite a lot of it is instinctual, quite a lot of it is hormonal and circumstantially influenced, and what we think are rational decisions that we're making on the basis of sound reasoning are quite often simply instinctual responses that we rationalize post hoc. The point being that all this idea of transcending nature or being freer or not, the left basically does not respect nature, it does not respect it's in a way it's quite Faustian because it wants to transcend human nature, and it has this noble ideal of equality and so on. Of course, equality can be quite perverse, but because it's utopian, it cannot match reality, and if it doesn't match reality, you will do quite cruel and crazy things to create utopia, especially if you're an ideologue, which is of course what the left has always done. Whereas I think rightist politics is simply about dealing with reality and dealing and defeating the entropy and the utopia. That's kind of what I was thinking about, the fight against entropy.